Amen. I love that old hymn, but sometimes it's nice to hear the same words with a different melody because it makes us think a little bit more about the words of that. And the story today, I assume the scripture reading was somewhat familiar to you about the man who was born blind. This still happens today, doesn't it? There are children that are born without eyesight. There are people who are born with various difficulties and stuff. But I think it's interesting the question that sort of leads off this passage, because I wonder how many of us would ask this question today. Who sinned, this man or his parents? I mean, is this not maybe an example of the superstitious mindset of the ancient world that because a person is born blind, that is because he's being punished for somebody's sin? We don't believe that, do we? Or do we? The truth is, we've only changed the vocabulary slightly in our modern age because it's very common for people to ask, whose fault is it that I turned out this way? Am I right? Some of you seem like a little unsure. Just tell you what, go look at the gossip columns, go watch the afternoon news programs and stuff, and let's see who's being blamed for what somebody's done. There are even many types of therapy where it is common to dig into a person's past, searching for the childhood traumas that we can blame for the reasons that we do the things that we do, or the way we've turned out. Whether the answer is given as parents or teachers, bullies, awkward moments, or lean times, it is not uncommon for people to project the responsibility for their issues outward. I didn't go to college because my parents couldn't support me. I can't stay in a lasting relationship because I come from a broken home. I have a short temper because I'm Irish. I don't know why you're laughing. How about this one? I don't go to church because my parents made me do it when I was growing up. Oh, what else did your parents make you do? Brush your teeth? You going to give up toothpaste? You going to give up deodorant? You going to give up eating your vegetables because mom and dad made you do it? Is that really adult behavior? Personal issues, whether major or minor, real or imagined, are often seen as something beyond a person's control. Well, in cases like blindness, especially congenital blindness, it is really beyond our control because it is unchangeable. But in other cases, like, let's say, managing our tempers, or the ability to stay in a lasting relationship, those things are more within our control, no matter how we grew up or what circumstances we grew up in. We can look at successful marriages that happened with people who came out of broken marriages. We can look at broken marriages that come out of people who came out of successful marriages. It's not about the circumstances, it's about the choices that we make. That is not to say that it is easy to overcome the circumstances of our upbringing, our habits, or even our personal limitations. It isn't. But it is to say that we possess the resources of the human spirit to choose our actions when we are able to act and to choose our attitudes towards unchangeable circumstances. Today, this is the first of a series of 4 messages in which I want to present a very simple plan of self-examination or growth or healing. I'd like to ask you, well, first of all, let me emphasize the word self-examination, because it is important for us to take responsibility for ourselves rather than looking to external causes to explain the reason we are the way we are. I invite you to consider, to identify in your own life a growth area or maybe a personal issue that you would like to work on. Now, here's the good news. You're keeping it to yourself, right? You're not telling us what it is. I mean, unless you really want to. But just think of a growth area or think of an area of a problematic issue. And in each of these 4 messages, I will present a step towards that growth or that healing and suggest ways that you can apply these principles in your life. So as an example, if you choose a growth area, kind of think of this as a sort of life coaching. And if you decide that you want to work on a problem area, think of these as a kind of, I don't know, maybe guided therapy or whatever. I am calling this 4-part series Becoming the Real You. Now, I tell you, when I hear something like that, my first thought is, oh, wow, that's it? That's the best he can come up with? It may sound like a very benign title. But I warn you, it is quite the opposite. Many of us wear masks. We engage in forms of self-deception. We often criticize or condemn things in other people that we overlook in ourselves. Any person who wants to overcome a problem or wants to experience growth have to be willing to endure a certain level of discomfort, possibly even pain, especially when it comes to confronting who we really are. Who we really are in light of who we want to be, or more importantly, who we are supposed to be. But that's not all. I'm not offering you a self-help course. This is a sermon series, right? This is church. The mirror we need to look into is not the world of our imagination. It is the mirror of God's truth. Think of this mirror of God's truth not as a place where we apply makeup, but as a place where we remove the layers of excuses and alibis that have kept us from seeing who we really are. So this first message is entitled, Seeing the Real You. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we began with the story of a man who was born without sight. See, there are many references in the Gospels about blindness and seeing. It would not surprise you if I were to say that it's not necessarily physical blindness or physical sight that is always the subject of those discussions in the New Testament, even though they are usually started by the healing of someone, like in our story today, who was physically blind. It is a reminder to us that our physical and mental conditions are not the real problem. In the case of seeing, physical blindness may be a disability, but it is not the life-altering problem that spiritual blindness is. And so this incident from John 9 becomes an example for us to compare our chosen growth area or our chosen problem area to the way that Jesus deals with this man who was born without eyesight. How do we come to see what our real problems or issues are, or maybe from a different angle? This story invites us to ask this question: am I blind to the truth? What is the first step in our program? Today, I'm only going to give you one step. The first step is separate the person from the problem. I bet that wasn't life-shattering, was it? It does not surprise you at all. Separate the person from the problem. Who you are is not the same thing as the physical or mental issues that you experience. They do affect you, of course, right? A man experiencing blindness clearly has a limitation that affects him on a daily basis. The struggles that we face are real, physical, mental. But the issue for the blind man is not that he was experiencing blindness, but rather what he does with this fact. Similarly, a soldier who loses a leg after standing on a landmine, and it's something that you hear about, he or she has to face new and unalterable circumstances. The loss of a leg is an unchangeable reality. But the true test of character is how the soldier responds to such circumstances. Some will get a prosthetic and learn how to walk. Some we've even seen have lost legs and have run in marathons. Others will despair and perhaps even take their own lives. While many of us may not experience blindness or the loss of a leg, we all face circumstances of loss and challenge. Right? As we age, we lose our youth, we lose that elasticity in our bodies. Sometimes we develop physical problems. Actually, pretty much all of us develop physical problems one way or another, right? Everybody we know, everybody we encounter has experienced a problem. It could have been a difficult childhood. It could be a job that you really hate. It could be the loss of a spouse. It could be cancer. And so on. And some challenges are even less obvious than these, such as extreme disappointment we face in others. On Wednesday night, we were having our discussion. We were talking about near-death experiences, and I asked the group, have you ever had an experience that was not life-threatening, but somehow you felt like you were grieving a loss? And I talked about how I lost a colleague back in my teaching days. I thought I knew him, and he didn't show up for pre-planning one year. And I sort of laughed it off as, how he didn't get the memo or he overslept or whatever. But as the day wore on, he didn't show up. And I discovered it's because he had been involved in an affair with another teacher. That was horrible. I hated that. But I was not prepared for the fact that I felt like I was grieving a death. The loss of a friend. We came to know some of you because we offered a class many years ago on Wednesday night on grieving, and some of you came not because you had lost a loved one, but because you were losing a church. And after having spent so much of your life in a particular church, congregation that is, you found that it was dying and it was painful. Some challenges are less obvious than others. The issue with any of these possibilities is that our sense of who we are sometimes gets tangled up with our circumstances. And so now, to grow, to get better, we have to untangle those circumstances. Additionally, we also have to distinguish between the limitations that we have in our bodies and our minds on the one hand, and on the other hand, the freedom that we have in our spirit to choose our attitudes or to make changes. Blindness, our genetics, and our other physical shortcomings may affect our bodies and our performances. So as an example, no matter how hard I try, I will never make myself 6 feet tall. Right? I don't know where that is. It's disgusting that my dad is 6'2", right? But I'll never get there. I'll also never be a quarterback in the NFL. Sorry to disappoint you about that. Beyond the limitations of the body and the mind is the spirit. It is the part of us that is untouched by sickness, by limitation. The spirit does not get COVID. The spirit does not get dementia. Now, you can expand that. I could go on a long list. Just take whatever you like, whatever illness, whatever physical limitation. The spirit does not experience that. It is the part of us where we act on our circumstances despite our physical and mental limitations. It's up to us individually to decide whether we allow ourselves to be limited by our physical situation or follow the prompting of our spirit. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 41, Jesus said to his disciples, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." The flesh, the body, is subject to sickness. It is subject to temptation. But it is an act of the Spirit to choose whether we're going to allow the body to dictate our actions or whether we are going to behave otherwise. This is why we fast, right? The body says, feed me, feed me. But we say, no. The Spirit is going to overrule that and say we are disciplining the body. It is an act of the Spirit to choose to follow the temptation or to allow the sickness to define who or what we are, or it is from the Spirit that we draw the strength to choose our attitudes, while the Spirit can be affected by the body that it is housed in, right? We are affected by our physical and mental limitations. It is really only hindered if we repress that spirit, if we deny it, if we hide behind excuses and say, well, I can't do this. I can't because, my parents didn't send me to college. Or I'm not 6 feet tall. We are always capable of choosing rightly even when we are hindered by physical or mental issues. I love this great example. Viktor Frankl wrote a book called The Hidden Cry for Meaning. And here's a great quote from there. Time and again, we psychiatrists meet patients whose response to their delusions is anything but pathological. I have met paranoiacs who, out of their delusional ideas of persecution, have killed their alleged enemies. But I have also met paranoiacs who have forgiven their supposed adversaries. The latter have not acted out of mental illness, but rather reacted to this illness out of their humanness. Now, today, I don't think we use the word paranoiac very often, but we talk about people who suffer from various forms of paranoia. It can be brought on by schizophrenia, it can be brought on by being bipolar, it can be brought on by things like Parkinson's disease, and so forth. But even the mind, when it is affected by such things, dementia too, Alzheimer's too, can make the choice, and he just lists example after example. Here is an example of people who suffered from a mental issue, but still chose to do the right thing. You see, the Spirit is the most human thing about us. When we access the resources of the Spirit, we can rise above circumstances. Now, that doesn't mean that we can grow a new leg. It doesn't mean that I can make myself 2 inches taller. What it means is that we can choose the way we react to circumstances, and even when we can't change circumstances, we can still choose our attitudes about them. And this is one of the reasons I advocate for what is called person-first language. I've talked about this before. I don't know if you remember it, but briefly I'll explain. Person-first language means that we do not describe a person by their circumstances. nor do we use a label or adjective at the beginning of their description. So as an example, in John chapter 9, verse 1, we read about a man who was born blind rather than a blind man. Do you hear a difference at all? A man who was born blind or a blind man. In other words, if we put the word blind first, we may prevent ourselves from seeing him as anything other than blind. Oh, he's blind? Okay, dismiss him. Let's go on to the next thing. This is especially true when we substitute the label for the person. Like I learned, we do not refer to people as slaves. We refer to people as people who have been or who have experienced enslavement. Now, that's kind of a long way of saying it, but what makes the difference? If you say slaves, you have created a category and you put people in that box. It's not the same thing as saying people who have experienced slavery. Person-first language is a verbal way of separating the person from the problem. This also explains the quibble that I have with 12-step programs and evangelical theology. Now you're thinking, well, Tom is really going way out on this one, right? Hear me out. When a person says, I am an alcoholic, are they not making their problem into their identity? Think about it. And how can we expect an alcoholic to be anything else but an alcoholic? I think it would be better to use first-person language and say, here is a person who struggles with alcohol. It doesn't change the fact that this person drinks to excess. But it maintains that while the body has this addiction, this craving for alcohol, the person still has to choose to pick up that bottle. Now, I've heard people who are addicted to drugs described as they can't help it. It's a disease. Well, okay, so I'm not addicted to drugs. I'm not an alcoholic. So how do I know any better, right? I'll tell you why. Because I drink 1 or 2 shots of tequila every night. But I have gone a week without a drink. We have bottles of wine in our pantry that have been sitting there for 3 years because nobody cares to open them. It's a matter of choice. Now, I know that it's easier for some than others. Some have a predisposition. I'm not arguing against that. It's just like if you're born blind, there's no point in telling that person, open your eyes and look. They can't do it. I understand that. But it is up to the person to decide whether to have a drink or not. And I know some of you have chosen, for good reasons, never to touch alcohol. In a similar way, evangelical theology, the theology which I think has kind of ruined America, makes people into sinners rather than people who struggle with sin. Have you ever heard somebody stand up and say, I'm a sinner, I can do nothing else but sin? Have you ever heard this? I've heard an awful lot of it. So maybe that's why their testimonies are so full of all the things that they've done. You see, I think it matters how we paint ourselves. Do we paint ourselves as sinners who cannot help it, or as people who struggle with the weaknesses of the flesh while drawing the strength of the Spirit? Paul wrote in Romans 8, verses 12 through 14, the following. So then, brothers and sisters, we are obligated not to the flesh to live according to the flesh, for if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Do you hear that contrast between spirit and flesh? Spirit and body? Yeah. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are the children of God. So let us return to our discussion of the man who was born blind in John chapter 9. The question raised by the disciples about his blindness assumes what? First of all, it assumes that the blindness was caused by a sin. It assumes also that the one who is punished is not necessarily the one who sins, right? Because he said, who sinned? This man or his parents? It sees the man as a helpless victim of circumstances rather than as a human being who can act in spite of his limitation. The answer that Jesus gave to this question redirected their thinking by giving the blindness a very unexpected meaning in their day. He says, so that God's works might be revealed in him. At first, you may find this answer bad because it sounds like, please put it back up there. The NRSV says, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Now, I can see a seminary student saying, oh, that's worse. God made him blind so that he could make a poster child out of him. That's not what Jesus is saying here, and that's why I decided to bring up the Revised Standard Version translation. Notice the difference. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be made manifest in him. See, the first thing to understand about Jesus' response is that the blindness is not a punishment. See what I mean? The blindness is not a punishment. Your physical limitation is not a punishment. It may be an accident of birth. It may be an accident caused by something else. But it is not a punishment for sin. Better yet, Jesus' response gives the suffering man, or the man suffering from blindness, the opportunity to demonstrate God's power in spite of his weakness. You see, a physical handicap, a tough break, or any other negative life situation says nothing about a person's character. It may limit your options, but it doesn't limit or define who you are. A person who has lost a leg can demonstrate resilience by learning to walk with a prosthetic. A man who grew up without a father can still be a loving dad, and so on. When Ann and I returned from vacation last week, we learned that Herman, everybody knows Herman, I'm not going to mention his last name since we're broadcasting online. We learned that Herman had been in the hospital with kidney stones and is now going through a process to have them removed. Now, usually when something like this happens, Bootsy or Cindy will call and let me know what's going on, but they were very considerate of our vacation and kept it a secret from us until we got back. So thank you to them for that. Before COVID, 3 years ago, can you believe, Herman was already suffering from diabetes, AFib, he's got a pacemaker, macular degeneration. In fact, Herman used to tell, he still gets a shot in the eye about every 12 weeks. And if I'm not mistaken, he also had kidney issues all at that same time. During COVID and since COVID, Herman has been housebound for the most part because even though he got the COVID vaccinations, his body has not been able to produce the antibodies that allow him to build up a resistance to COVID. But to add to his problems, his kidneys reached a point to where he had to go into dialysis. So add dialysis to his list of things. Several months ago, he was diagnosed with a bronchial issue, and I can't say it, so let's just say a bronchial issue. About a month and a half ago, he had a toe amputated due to the effects of diabetes on his foot. And now, kidney stones. You see, these days, whenever we talk on the phone, Bootsy tells me, Herman's developed yet another ailment, and we sort of joke about checking off boxes and predicting what comes next and so on. But you see, that's the thing. If you talk to Herman, and I know you have, you would think that there's nothing wrong with him, right? What does Herman say? How you doing? What does he say? Oh, I'm peachy dory. Talking with Herman, you wouldn't think that he has a care in the world. But here's the thing. If I were to ask any of you to describe Herman, you would not start with, well, he's got AFib and kidney stones. And you wouldn't start with his problems, right? You might say something like, what a loving person he is. What a kind elder he was. He sang in the choir and would still be singing in the choir if he were able. In other words, when we see Herman, we see the person and not the problems. Many of you are familiar with FODAC. In fact, we were talking about how to get over there just a little while ago. Friends of Disabled Adults and Children. But did you know that it was originally called FODA, Friends of Disabled Adults? And it was started in the mid-1980s by Ed and Annie Bouchard. Ed, who looked like Santa Claus, came to Atlanta Christian College, where Ann and I were students, back in the 1980s, and he spoke in our chapel. So it was like in the early days when he was getting started. I think he had a white van with a logo on it and so forth. So he asked the group in the chapel, how many of us have physical handicaps? And, actually, very few people raised a hand. He says, are you sure? And he said, how many of you are wearing glasses? And then we got the point. We all have our issues. Some of them are bigger than others. But to each of us, of course, our own problems are the most important. But the point is not that we have problems, not that we suffer from limitations, etc. It's how we respond to them that matters. Do we take responsibility for them? Or do we try to blame them on others? More importantly, when we look at ourselves, how do we see ourselves? The secret to growth or healing, beginning with step 1, separate the person from the problem. Consider the following questions as we close. What do you see as the obstacle or obstacles to being your true self? Do you make excuses that keep you from your true self or from living a fuller life? Can you see any ways that you can be your true self in spite of physical or mental obstacles? What is something that God has been able to accomplish in your life despite your weakness? The path forward is to be open, to let ourselves be open to a radical self-examination. Better yet, to let ourselves be examined by God. As the hymn writer James Orr wrote, "Search me, O God, and know my heart today. Try me, O Savior, know my thoughts, I pray." Anybody know this hymn? "See if there be some wicked way in me. Cleanse me from every sin and set me free." The things that hold us back from reaching our full potential as human beings and as believers are the layers of masks and excuses that we've been making for why we are the way we are. This is not to deny that we face challenges. It is only to say that even those challenges should not define who we are. So why not remove the weight of excuses, masks, and self-deception and make ourselves ready to accept the responsibility for the course of our lives? Are we ready to come clean? Are we ready to step into the light and let God examine us and show us who we were created to be? The first step is to separate ourselves from our problems, so that we can take a fresh look at ourselves and see the real me and you.